Um, so welcome to the masterclass that I'm giving around this topic of brand management and the challenge of authenticity. My name is Professor Michael Beverland. I joined here at the University of Sussex just over 2 years ago. I'd previously worked at other universities and have done quite a lot of work over time on the issue of authenticity and marketing. Okay. And so what I want to do today is, provide, an overview of what we know about authenticity in the area of branding, and then also provide a way of thinking about it in a more systematic way, and also then thinking about how we might play with it or innovate around authenticity to either adapt to the times or actually take our brands in ways that perhaps others thought and we may have thought couldn't actually move. So I'm going to jump in. A lot of the work that I'm doing now and what I'm presenting is forthcoming in my new book called Brand Management, Co-Creating Meaningful Brands. It's actually a second edition of my text, which originally came out in 2017. Obviously did reasonably well, and now it's coming out in a second edition where I've sort of rewrote quite a lot of it around the idea of authenticity. And partly, I guess it was motivated by the sense that in the sort of what we call co-creation, the idea that the brand's meaning is really shaped by us, it's shaped by the consumer or the customer in the case of B2B, but also, of course, the context in which both of those players are operating, which can include obviously influencers, popular culture, and so on and so forth. That authenticity has become quite central to concerns around brand equity, and we see that in quite a number of published studies, but we've also seen it in relation to the recent moves by Interbrand to include issues of brand authenticity, their measure of their valuation exercise, which is kind of nice to see. I started working in with this idea back in about 2003, published a book in 2009 called Building Brand Authenticity, which then kind of took off and had a lot of impact, I guess, on practice, but also had quite a lot of impact around measures and how things are tracked and how equity measures are developed as well. I guess the simple question to start with is what is authenticity? This is always the basic challenge that anyone struggles with when we come to the idea of authenticity. There tends to be a belief that it must be in some way objectively true. So it's not unusual to see kind of critics on Twitter, for example, highlighting how, consumers, sort of ironically saying consumers want authenticity and then presenting evidence that showing that they're clearly buying into a fake or buying into a myth or buying into an idea with really no necessary substance, or in which the actions of the brand may potentially contradict what they're saying. This, in a way, there's some truth to that, but there's also, in a sense, a bit of a mistake. We know that the sort of old idea that we used to play with in marketing, and when I say old, I mean this is the original idea of authenticity going right back to the ancient times, is that it's an objective marker of origin and proof that you're buying the genuine article. But we've sort of moved beyond that, I guess, in the post-World War II era, when we saw a lot more symbolic, or brands becoming a lot more symbolic in terms of their approaches, so not just being names of categories in which they are part of, but actually standing for bigger ideals and bigger ideas. That authenticity has become, in a sense, detached, or at least partly detached or decoupled from what the brand's sort of historic truth, or even the basic actions of the brand. And consumers will buy into this. I mean, our job is really to provide the way in which for consumers to buy into this through the use of particular strategies or cues. So we know from a whole ton of studies done in the last 20 years that the seemingly real is much more powerful than the actual real. As long as consumers can buy into it so they can place themselves within the brand story and keep their brand relationship going, they will continue to believe in the main story and the main claims of the brand. And critically, we know in this era of fake news, for example, that those processes of only really picking out the things that confirm our worldview and screening out the things that disconfirm our worldview is also something consumers have been doing for some time. We just call it motivated reasoning. And it simply means that if I want to authenticate a brand, I look for all the reasons why I can keep authenticating the brand. And I dismiss or, or derisively treat and ignore anything that is oppositional to that. And it's really only if things get kind of too difficult for us to negotiate paradoxes or to no longer suspend disbelief that we start to really query the brand. So the critical thing around authenticity in the marketplace and authenticity in branding is this idea that it's performed. It involves work, and that still enables consumers to experience the brand as real, genuine, and true. And on that last point, there is this idea that if authenticity ultimately can be anything, and that's partly what I'm saying, is that it's subjective and it's experienced by the consumer, and it is ultimately also socially constructed, a point I'll come to next. That is it useful as an idea? And the reality is that yes, it is. It's still incredibly meaningful for the consumer. If that consumer is within a network or within an online or offline community, it's extremely powerful as an idea. And it does mean that, and because it's socially constructed, we also know that it ultimately, lots of individual consumers can effectively come to the same idea or converge around the same idea for the brand. So that is a kind of, I guess, a very short overview of philosophy around authenticity, which is a very tricky idea. But the critical thing that I'm going to say today is that it's ultimately performed, which of course then raises the question for us as marketers is how do we perform it effectively? And although authenticity is subjective, I've also said it's socially constructed. Now, what do I mean by that? Originally, the idea of authenticity comes from the ancient Greek, and it effectively implied that what is authenticity only comes from within. It can't be something that's motivated externally. So it can't be something that we would do for profit, but neither can it be something that is done because other people, the crowd, think we should go along with it. And this idea, for example, still continues, even though we know in a sense that's not true. Consumers openly know that brands are obviously doing things for profit. They're doing things for a reason. But they can diminish that if they can find other elements of the brand that suggest that it's doing it for some deeper purpose or some deeper meaning. But nonetheless, all of these old ideas of authenticity, that it's not something that's commercial, that it has to be genuinely true, that it can't be motivated for personal gain or motivated by the need to just adapt to market trends and so on and so forth. Those things are still ideas out there socially. So we need to work within those boundaries in a sense to continue to at least communicate that we are conforming to those sort of ideal types of authenticity. Again, to ensure that the consumer can simply keep believing it. So effectively, the brand is drawn between what the consumers wants and what they're trying to achieve and how they might experience it individually. And then also what the rules of the game are in any particular category or any particular society at the time in terms of how those or what the standards of judgment of authenticity are. If you look at a lot of work on authenticity, there's always been this tension around what we call the being-doing challenge, all right? Is it something essential to my character or is it something I perform? And all the work I've ever done has suggested the answer is both. The old idea that genuine authenticity is about being is highly questionable when we come to branding, but also where it's come from out of the artistic world and so on. That being itself is ultimately a performance. If you're, of course, trying to communicate something deep within your character, you're obviously putting on a performance. It means it can be faked, but it also means that ultimately, if you have it, you need to distill it in a way that can be communicated effectively. So to think about being first, if we think about being authentic, all of these terms come up as synonyms for being. So it's the idea of living, reality, actuality, what I like is essential nature. And so I call this the notion of brand character, that ultimately your brand's deeper character is really an issue of it being. And this is built up, obviously, over time. It's built up, of course, by ensuring that your core values of your brand are spread deep within the organization, that they drive your hiring, and that you've owned this space and this idea for many, many years, in some cases decades or even longer. So effectively, the brand character aspect, or the being of authenticity, really, of course, goes to deeper levels of engagement. You're not just doing this as a fad or a fashion. So if you think about, brand purpose, or some of the main kind of, I guess, social drivers at the moment, such as Black Lives Matter and so on, a lot of the debate is around this. I mean, how serious is the level of engagement? Have you actually, really changed? Have you really operated in this space before? Or are you just picking up, like we often see with Pride Month? Are you just really picking up on, the moment of the times and trying to cash in? It's a personal commitment or an organizational commitment. It involves the embodiment of certain values. So it goes deeper than just saying you have values. You actually, of course, have to demonstrate it in practice. And it can come from being engaged in the focal activities with the field. So for a lot of those brands that are embedded in communities, say either of sports fans or of any number of different activities, that you're actually, out there, you actually understand what it means to perform in those particular contexts. So you speak as an insider. So that's brand character. The other part of the equation is doing authenticity. And this has always been seen as more the faking it side of authenticity. And I think that's wrong. I think what we see is that brands are very high on character. That's a good thing, but it doesn't give them any forward momentum. As we know, that brands ultimately have to balance two challenges. They have to be very consistent over time, which would be their character, but they also ultimately have to be relevant. They have to speak to the immediacy of today, all right, or of the short term. And that's a doing aspect. And if we look at synonyms for doing, what we see are issues of performance, exploitation, achievements, accomplishments, actions. All of these are things that historically have kind of gone against the original ideas of authenticity as somehow being intrinsic, deeply felt, not motivated by any external audience or concerns. But nonetheless, it's also a performance that needs to be played to. It can relate to notions of style and fashion. It can be captured in the idea of cool, acting the part. So there's this idea in authenticity of what we call type authenticity. So for example, if you want to be a fine wine, as where I started my work, you have to do certain things, right? There's certain rules to the game. Likewise, if you're a discount brand, there's certain rules to the game, all right? And there's certain cultural codes you may use to suggest that you're part of that club. It can suggest insincerity, which is a problem and something we need to be very mindful of. Ultimately, because sincerity is really now, if it's not truth, sincerity or motive is the critical standard by which claims of authenticity are judged. And it's done with strategic intent. And I call this brand improvisation. This is the brand relevance side of the equation of authenticity, that the brand ultimately, right, has to keep its claims of authenticity fresh, while at the same time tying them back to the central story or the central character of the brand. Now, where I'm going with all that, obviously that gives us the ability to start thinking about different options in a classic marketing 2x2 of brand improvisation and brand character. Obviously, at the very top, we have the authentic brand that's both high in improvisation, but also high in character. If you think about a new brand or an organization that really hasn't perhaps leveraged its reputation into a brand, we call this a nascent brand. They're obviously new. They don't have either character nor improvisation, and they've just got some work to do. Those brands that I would say are very high on improvisation, so very high on the doing aspects of authenticity, but not so much on the being, tend to be seen as posers. These are brands that jump in and out of social causes, but they may also attempt to co-opt different subcultures or ethnic cultures in the marketplace, largely to be cool. You can think about brands like this in the sort of fast fashion type arena. But if you think about that and extend it more into issues of purpose and so on, you can see that quite a lot of brands fall under this umbrella. Here, they're not really, it's really difficult to tell whether they genuinely are sincere in their intent. And so there's a deficit of authenticity that comes from a lack of character. And then, of course, we have the opposite, which is a brand that's very high in character, but very low in improvisation. If you think about this in classical terms, and as a brand that's very high on consistency, but very, very low on relevance, they seem to be aloof. And this is, of course, what you see coming out of the classical view of authenticity, where you stand apart from the market, the idea that you're authentic, where you don't, of course, do as people want. You don't do what the customer wants. In fact, you openly, in many ways, despise your customers, is all very well. Some people will play along with it in a sort of very strange way, but ultimately, all right, you'll just be seen as essentially rather tired and ultimately start to fail. Let's have some examples. I was recently very lucky to be able to visit Yamaha and Hamamatsu in Japan late last year to write up a case study on their internal branding efforts and their whole shift away from multiple expressions of the brand around each of their music divisions into one brand expression under this wonderful term, make waves. And they've been doing that. That's been really a kind of top to bottom exercise where Simon Oss and his team out in Japan went through the organization and had to spend a lot of time convincing, very dedicated, proud professionals that this one expression of the brand would work across different types of music, so that it would work across classical piano for orchestras, but also, of course, work in rock, work in electronic dance music, and go right through, including into golf clubs, of all things. And of course, their interbrand numbers in the Japanese market have been, attributed to the success of this program that's been running for the last 18 months to 2 years. I think I won't get much pushback on the idea that Pepsi's ad with Kendall Jenner, which was somewhat of a tone-deaf failure to read the room exercise in influencer marketing, it's probably a great example of a poser in the sense that if you remember the ad, and it did only run for a day before it was actually pulled, that effectively an influencer that's got no real skin in this game is somehow picking up on a sort of what seems to be a kind of Black Lives / Me Too type protest, although it's not really clear what it is, and then walks up and hands a police officer in heavy military riot gear a Pepsi, and everyone just gets on, is not really going to cut the mustard in terms of authenticity, and the feedback was fairly quick and fairly severe. One of the ads that I like as a piece of creative work, but I do wonder about its relationship to the brand, is Renault's recent campaign. It's a beautiful story. It's a beautiful piece of brand storytelling with one problem. It doesn't really say much about the brand. So it's a flip side on the sort of coming of age type story of a couple, but in this case, of course, is a lesbian couple that tells the story from both sides, and eventually, of course, it's a happy ever after story. But of course, Renault in itself hasn't got really any sort of history in this area, and it doesn't even really feature the brand that heavily or any of the brand's values. So again, it's seen as essentially something that's probably right for the times. It speaks to issues of discrimination and so on, and it's a powerful social message, but its lack of connection to the brand undermines its authenticity. And then I think nascent brands, there's a wonderful brand that I've been looking at for a while now called Uma, which of course is a skincare range that's all based around the founder's dedication to creating different makeup tones for different skin tones, rather than, of course, seeing ultimately a white skin tone as either the ideal type or being a very niche brand targeting very specific cultures. They're actually embracing the diversity that we have in the world, and of course, starting out hopefully on a very long and successful journey of delivering this story and extending the story across a whole range of products. So how do we get from each of these sort of stages? Each of course has a deficit. So let's think about how we might actually build authenticity in this space. And we'll start with the easiest in a sense. And I say the easiest theoretically, it's not obviously the easiest practically. The classic move of the nascent brand to the authentic brand. And then we'll look at the other two deficits and how you might actually overcome these. The classic issue around building, all right, and we'll look at that in relation to three types of authenticity. The second move we'll have a look at in relation to how do we move from being aloof to being authentic. And I think this is where storytelling becomes quite powerful as a tool. And I think the movement from poser to authentic is perhaps where brand purpose has a real role to play in communicating effectively more character in your brand. So there's a lot more depth to your engagement with particular issues than perhaps there has been or would first appear. So let's unpack each. The move from nascent brand to authentic brand is really your classic kind of brand building exercise. And those of you who might be familiar with any of the ideas of brand pyramids or classical branding models of building, essentially resonance and recall and all of these types of things, we'll see where we're going with this. In work on authenticity, there's kind of three types of things we play with as big ideas, and some of them are a little bit surprising. There's a surprising amount of research that shows that conformity is really, really critical for marketplace authenticity. And what that really means is just in the name, that obviously we align with the norms of the category. We may align with the norms of the subculture if we're targeting it. We may align with the norms of society if that's where we're going. But there's a certain expectation that we will be true to type. So to go back to my example around fine wine, if you were going to embrace a kind of, build a fine wine brand, you would not talk heavily about your brand. You would not talk heavily about how this is the best wine ever. You'd probably talk a lot about your region, all right, about the soils in which it's grown in, the heritage that you're continuing, the types of methods that you would use in that category. And that would show effectively that you were dealing with points of parity and building salience through a range of cultural codes in that category. All right, and as I say, if you think about the basic base of the brand pyramid, it's primarily a move around identity and points of parity to say, this is where I'm operating in. That, of course, also has to be complemented over time with consistency. So obviously you're going to have a set of promises that you have, and then you're going to execute that over time so that we see that it's credible. So consistency is, again, another type of authenticity, and it's the obvious one. It's the one everyone expects, in case captured in that idea of you walk the walk as well as talk to talk. Effectively, you're just, whatever you're saying you are, you're actually delivering on it. And then finally, this idea of connection, and this connection could be a literal connection. So if I say that I'm a brand that's very much speaking to, say, a particular place or a particular subculture, say I'm effectively saying that I'm part of say a cycling community, then I actually can demonstrate that I either have direct connections to the cycling community, but even better than that, would actually speak as an insider within that particular community, so that most of my associations are implied and much more natural. But connection is critical, and that helps build greater emotional resonance. And so obviously these are stages. Start with conformity to signal where you are, build a consistent story over time, and then turn that into greater emotional resonance between you and your target user. I think Dollar Shave is a really great example of this. It's an example I've tracked for a bit, and I like that, they talk a lot about, they use a lot of the codes around discount, the cheap production values of the first set of videos, with the emphasis, of course, reinforcing the emphasis that they're focused on stripping razors down to the bare minimum, but of course still delivering. They of course express this a whole range over a series of different ads across a campaign that was sustained over time across different media. And then as they of course get more successful, but then they also got brought out, and got some more money put behind them, they could, of course, embrace better production values, but they started to retain the character of the brand, the humor and the style, but of course embrace the rituals that each of us have as men. And you also saw within the ad trans characters, and also, of course, women as well. So they're obviously reaching out to a broader range of target users now. All the little rituals that we embrace in our private sphere while we're actually shaving. So speaking as someone who really gets the idea of the shaving ritual. If we look at the issue around moving from aloof to authentic, the challenge here is storytelling. You probably have, all these great things that are happening, right, back in your brand, but you either don't have the stories to deliver on it, or you don't, in many ways, just have the innovations to deliver on it. Either way, you've got to, of course, somehow take what you do and connect it to an audience. So storytelling ultimately helps you connect. And of course, it also therefore helps you conform to your category. And those tend to be the two deficits that you're operating on when you're in the aloof mode. You've got consistency in spades. That's the problem. And I think Yamaha is an example I would go back to here. If you look at the first image on my left, you see all the different expressions of the brand. A classic example of a larger seller type brand, but not necessarily having really strong emotional resonance with its audience in terms of its imagery. And of course, every division within the company being able to express itself in unique ways, on the basic argument that, of course, every musical genre is different, every subculture is different, and therefore ultimately, we need to play to that rather than have a more overall uniform type brand experience. Two, of course, the movement that we see through Make Waves on my right, with a whole range of obviously different musical situations being positioned, and also much more emotional resonance in the brand around this whole idea of making waves, which links the brand ultimately to the idea of music and waveforms, but critically, of course, then also links it to the idea of making an impact, whether it's a personal impact or whether it's an impact on an audience. Yamaha are quite happy to live with that ambiguity because they embrace both. If we look at the poser type situation and how we overcome this deficit, this is a real issue of brand purpose. And so we stress, of course, that obviously our purpose needs to be sincere. As I mentioned earlier, if truth isn't the basis of authenticity any longer, sincerity is. And this is why we often see populist politicians actually being seen as more authentic, because, of course, they seem to go against the grain. They say things that perhaps they shouldn't, or that so-called elites think they shouldn't, and therefore, of course, they're seen as a lot more sincere because they speak their minds. This, of course, aligns you with a sense of conformity. You were lacking here in the poser stage of really conforming to any sort of type or any sort of subcultural context in which you exist. And then, of course, you can express that consistently over time to ensure that you're showing that you're dedicated, all right, to the purpose for which you're espousing. One brand that my last Harvard case study that I wrote up, it came out just recently this year, I use in my MBA classes and also in some of my master's classes, was Shinola Detroit. And that's a story really of a questionable purpose. It starts off obviously in the ruins, in a sense, the kind of figurative ruins of Detroit, being a city that had to declare bankruptcy, and trying to pick up on this idea that if we can revive manufacturing in the sort of soul or heart of America's manufacturing prowess, we can speak to a greater kind of desire within the nation of, America, making America great again, for want of a phrase. And so they did a lot of work to suggest that they were, of course, from Detroit. They said they were made in Detroit. They obviously linked to a lot of things around, I guess, claims of nationalism without necessarily the political side of things. But they, of course, ultimately this was unpicked a little bit. The first unpicking came from Federal Trade Commission that said that you're not actually made in Detroit, let alone even made in America. many of your watch parts, of course, come from all around the world, and you effectively just assembled it in your factory. And even that's not necessarily true, as you have many, of course, suppliers that are assembling your materials for some of your accessories. And then, of course, there was also some critique within the city of Detroit, this city that's obviously very much an African-American city. It's got a huge racial history and one of immense tension and violence. The Shinola brand was a brand of boot polish originally that was then used, but of course it comes with a lot of racist imagery. And so there was a whole rethink Shinola movement with the old idea that this is a white savior brand coming in to, again, capitalize on cheap property in Detroit and capitalize on misery, but hasn't really done anything for the city itself, and doesn't really say anything about the real soul of the city and the real inhabitants of the city. What was interesting is their response effectively was to go back and firstly they feature a lot of their employees within Shinola who do assemble these parts. Very skilled employees, that they're obviously African American, so they feature those people within the brand story itself. But to sort of overcome the claim that they're not really picking up on the true, I guess, spirit of Detroit, they went out more broadly into the city itself, particularly away from the very narrow geographical limits of where the sort of Detroit revival is occurring, and picking up on a whole range of different people, immigrant stories of people working hard to do right by their family, create businesses, these sorts of timeless American ideals that people buy into in the United States, to talk about, to really embed their brand within the city itself. They obviously did a number of things. They of course have invested rather heavily in the downtown area in Detroit, and so on, effectively putting down roots. This has, of course, enabled them to really deal with the sincerity question, even though the manufacturing challenge of their parts is one that's much harder to solve, because, of course, many of those manufacturing sectors either never existed in the United States when it came to watches, or haven't existed for a very, very long time. And so they sort of switch out and try and capture the idea of not so much being made in Detroit, but more, I guess, made of Detroit as an idea. I'd also suggest, just to sort of finish, is that one can then play around with some of these kind of moves as well. When I was presenting this as an idea to some colleagues of mine that I've worked with over time, they said, can we make it a little bit more dynamic as an idea? Are there situations where, for example, you might want to be a little bit aloof and then tie that back into your story? You might want to be a little bit nascent if you're an established brand and tie that back into your story, and so on. You may even want to be a poser if you want to disrupt your brand narrative to pick up on a larger social message. And I thought, well, that's really interesting, because I think a lot of my own research work that I've done over the years has looked at this. I've done a lot of work trying to link design thinking into branding, and I was seeing this in my data and looking at ways in which brands were transformed, turned around, but even, of course, disrupted in their messages, and then ultimately had their histories rewritten a bit. And so you see a number of examples. I think that the shift between being authentic and being aloof is what we call a classic cultural brand strategy. One of the sectors, obviously, that does this all the time is the luxury sector. Obviously, trying to link into, institutions such as opera, the arts, older sports such as sailing, horse racing, and so on, that are kind of very elite, they're very expensive, and they kind of reaffirm traditions. In many ways, this has been done because these brands have also marketed themselves over time. So they're, of course, trying to shore up their character aspects of coming from a very, very particular world, a world of obviously wealth and luxury, but also the cultural world is also a world, if it's the world of the arts, that doesn't speak to commerce. And so, of course, it actually enhances the character of their brands. So the cultural move can be done here. Equally, you could think of moving into a whole range of different social ideals if you wanted to pick up on that, as long as you were able to communicate it effectively. I think those same brands, I mean, a lot of the luxury sector, but you could also say a lot of the more established athletic type brands and so on. Sometimes, of course, partner with newer brands as a sort of progressive move. I use the term progressive to try to move their stories on, give them a sense that they're still relevant and still new. So I think about many of the brands that, of course, do collections with Supreme are classic examples of high-end brands partnering with this very I guess cult-driven brand, although it's a very highly valued brand now, to give them street cred, to give them a sense of buzz, to give them a sense of scarcity that perhaps they don't have or can't capture through their own everyday branding activities that are targeted at loyalists or the new sort of democratization of luxury, so to speak. And I think a poser brand is much more of a disruptive type of strategy. When might we want to be a poser? I think of a brand like Gillette really trying to rethink its best a man can get strategy. And I guess it's still, in a sense, it's still, I guess the story is still to be written in a way of what will happen with this. But initially, of course, they were seen as a huge poser when they picked up on the Me Too movement, right? And in many ways parodied their brand. There was enormous backlash from their users. But they also had to make that brand more relevant to a much younger consumer group because, of course, shaving was becoming less popular as we've seen the emergence of, or the return of facial hair. And so you saw through a series of different ads over time, really doubling down on this issue of purpose, whether it's through connections to Raheem Sterling and racism, whether it's through to first responders, connections to first responders, or whether it's through to a father teaching their trans son to shave for the first time. It's effectively trying to shift the idea of man or masculinity. And so it's still trying to own the space it has, but it realizes that its historic story is very limited in speaking for the times. And so it's a much more disruptive strategy, probably a much more challenging one that requires actually, of course, standing fast in the face of criticism to show that you're actually sincere in your intent. How might you do this? There's a number of strategies I would suggest very broadly that you could embrace. I think the first one is immersion. One can immerse the user in the brand story, or one can also immerse the brand within the world of the consumer. It's co-creation after all, so it has to go both. You have to know the context in which the consumer is operating, whether it's their own life context or the social world in which they're part of, including any sort of brand community or subculture. But also, of course, being able to immerse the consumer in the story and the behind-the-scenes story of the brand is equally a powerful tool for gaining authenticity. You might wonder why I've got Flight of the Conchords here, but I think this is a classic example of probably of a national character trait as from New Zealand, but also of downplaying their success and their prowess. So we see a lot of, if we go back to that original idea that obviously authenticity comes from within and it doesn't come necessarily from the marketplace, downplaying through other narratives are really important. So downplaying your prowess, your success, being a lot more humble in the face of what you're doing is another way that's a very powerful way of achieving authenticity. Obviously connecting, it's maybe connecting to place, connecting to others, enabling, providing the brand or making the brand be something that actually provides what we call linking value in marketing. So to connect other like-minded people together is a very useful strategy. I'd say alignment is still the classic tool of making sure. This speaks obviously to consistency, but it can speak to the other two challenges of connection and conformity as well. Making sure that there's, whatever you say you're doing in terms of your purpose and your story aligns to all the ways in which you operate as an organization, to all the partners that you use, but also a clear evaluation of perhaps your history and your past and what you might need to overcome should you embrace a certain ideal or purpose. And then balancing. We know that we operate in a fairly messy world, and so in many ways branding has been a focus of absolute clarity and consistency, but sometimes embracing a little bit of ambiguity, by balancing different messages out. We know we have to do it when we deal with different stakeholder groups, and sometimes being a little bit strategically ambiguous is actually quite useful in the marketplace. As a way of suggesting that we are kind of dealing with this messy situation ourselves, all right, or balancing out right, both a commercial motive, but perhaps an artistic motive, or perhaps a social motive, and so on and so forth. So just in conclusion, I want to leave you with these thoughts that authenticity is always created or performed. It's not real in the truest historic sense of the word. So you may have a history, it may be true, but you have to perform that history. You have to, of course, turn it into an interesting story so that people will engage with it. Don't just take it for granted. We know there's something called narrative transportation, which picks up on the first point, the idea that the consumer will continue to believe you as long as they can see themselves in your story. That ultimately, of course, is how authenticity is co-created. They're less mindful that the fact that they know you're a commercial entity. They may even know that there's a sense of stylization, all right, and being liberal with the truth, and that's okay, as long as they can continue that connection. That's all that matters. You do need to balance these three things, challenges of consistency, conformity, and connection over time. Not just as you grow a brand, but of course, as you suffer deficits. But even when you're authentic, you may, of course, have to keep investing in each three. And in some cases, one may become more important if the external environment changes. Brand purpose and brand storytelling are strategies that enable you to overcome authenticity deficits. And you can use those strategies on the previous slide that I showed to do that, but they are both useful tools to actually, of course, address issues in terms of a lack of consistency or a lack of connection. And then also, of course, make sure that you know your brand deeply, not just, of course, what the organization does, but know your brand's heritage, backstory, behind the scenes, but also know the shifting context of which you're a part. It's not just your user, but the world the user exists in, and even the greater society that the consumer exists in, can all impact on how well your brand's messages actually resonate, and also whether there are shifting rules to the game that you have to be aware of. And with that, I will thank you, and I will take any questions. Oh, we have a couple of questions that came in a little bit earlier. Well, I think so. The question is, has social media and increased public interaction with brands made things more challenging for organizations? And I think firstly, I mean, it's made authenticity much more contested, obviously, and it's made it much easier to audit. So one of the things we know that historically you could of course sustain a whole range of brand messages through when we were just in a scenario with mainstream media or the historic mainstream media, because there was such a delay in any investigations ever unpicking them, and there may not have been any great motive to do so, particularly of course if the brands advertised through the mediums. We know with social media that of course consumers can very easily, and activists and so on, can very easily unpick brand claims. But they can also even create memes that are simply false, that the brand has to deal with to make sure that they don't effectively, sink in or start to resonate and create more problems, even though there's no actual truth to them. So I think that is true, and I think the more we start, we are already under much greater scrutiny than we've ever been before, and authenticity then becomes an issue not only of being able to demonstrate that what you're saying is true, and you can demonstrate it over time, but it would come right down through to things like tone of voice, whether you engage with the message. I've seen many brands, particularly when they've been criticized or challenged, that they sort of stay silent on key issues. And this is a real problem for the brand. I mean, if you're going to put yourself out there on social media, you need to have an engagement strategy. And you need to be prepared to, do so in the right tone that does effectively live the brand, so to speak. So I think that has become a lot more challenging. The other thing I would say is, have we reached peak brand purpose? I think that's an interesting question. I think the idea of brand purpose has been a little bit misunderstood. It's become associated with a social purpose. So the idea of for a lot of marketers that brand purpose means we align with a social cause. you know, a classic kind of CSR type strategy. And that's not what brand purpose really is. There was, you know, some of the early work that's really been unpicked in terms of just how methodologically sound it was. That has really been challenged. We know if we ask consumers that social missions and social purposes don't come up particularly high in what they want. But the old idea of taking a stand, of caring about something, remains very, very powerful, and it's central to brand messages. So I think, if anything, brand purpose is another way of thinking about what is it that we do and what is it that motivates us as a brand that's bigger than ourselves. So if you think about, there's a wonderful ad that I watched by Leica, the German camera maker, you know, where effectively they spend, you know, close to 45 minutes talking about just showing you a block of metal, and that block of metal being machined into one of their, you know, precision cameras. And in that, they're talking about a logic of slow, and they're talking about how they care about craft, and how good things take time. And it's a classic message that a lot of craft-driven manufacturers, you know, use. But of course, it's a purpose. It's saying that what we care about is making the very, very best. And Huawei and other organizations also have a very similar purpose behind them. Make Waves by Yamaha, I would argue, is about purpose. It's about giving the musician, you know, as they say, their logic, it's always the musician first. Everything we do is designed around to make the musician stand out and the instrument sink into the background. That is a purpose. So I think peak purpose is this idea that we're just going to embrace a social cause and then try and get away with it, has really been unpicked because it just doesn't really work. But, you know, true purpose, which can be social, Unilever, I would argue, is one of the earliest embodiments of brand purpose, is their focus on hygiene and personal health, and they've never stepped away from that, through to much more aspirational ideals. And all of those aspirational ideals can be found in the language, ultimately, of authenticity. It's about sincerity, potentially it's about creativity, it's about dedication to work, dedication to task, caring for others. You can fill that, you know, that kind of purpose box with a lot of things. The critical thing is you've got to actually be able to live with it. So just to pick up, Karina asks, and that's a nice follow-up actually, how do I feel that sustainability, CSR, and ethics are affecting brand and consumer preferences? I think what we do know is that if you ultimately, of course, if you ask consumers this, you get two responses. One is that they care immensely, but then you don't see it really followed up in their actual preferences and choices. So the classic expectation behavior gap, which is really ultimately, if we ask consumers in a public situation, they're always going to, you know, do the socially responsible thing and tell you what you want to hear. What we know, if you ask consumers, obviously privately, is they rate these things relatively low. It's not to say that they are ultimately, I guess, unimportant. It probably means that they're becoming increasingly issues of conformity and points of parity, that we expect our products and our, you know, and our services to somehow speak to sustainability, to speak to issues of ethics and so on. That outside of, you know, effectively very particular target markets that really live some of these values, that you need to, of course, tick all the other boxes around performance and deliverability and so on and so forth, and then wrap all that up in a story of that contain all of those more classic type purpose things. So I wouldn't give up on them, but I wouldn't necessarily say that's the defining feature of our brand and our brand promise to the user. It's more important to show it than actually say it. David asks a really good question for nascent brands, i.e. SMEs. What tools would you recommend them to upscale quickly to become authentic? This is a really fascinating question, and I can't say that I have a clear answer on this, because I think there is this idea that authenticity does take time. One of the things I would firstly do is think about, you know, what's the spirit of the times? So is there some bigger issue that you think as an SME you can speak to that has really got a finger on the pulse, and perhaps as a new brand, you are unencumbered with a sort of with the baggage that a more established brand has, that you can link it into your own personal backstory. So for many SMEs, of course, the brand essentially is really closely aligned with the story of the founder or founders. Is there something there that you'll continue to do that gives it a kind of much greater historic truth? And that may be in the backstory of you personally, or even in your sort of family lineage, or so on, that you can speak to that more broadly. And then, express it consistently over time, make very, very clear forms of communication and stick with them. But I would really perhaps embrace this sort of tension out there in society, and what can we speak that would resonate now? And of course, then always looking at whether, other people are doing that and are more better resourced as well, and that maybe you have to take a slightly different twist on it. Jonathan asks a really interesting question as well. How do brands resonate with customers that cut across different cultural diversities with different values? This is an interesting question. I think if we take the idea that authenticity is important, we also know it's culturally situated. And for some cultures, I guess particularly what we call broadly a Western culture, what is authentic will really, is something that we can obviously communicate across a whole range of different nation states, because we share a certain set of values and that are obviously established in philosophy and literature and so on. But you might find that the expressions are different. So I know that, for example, when Glenfiddich embarked on its transformation to embrace a sort of, I guess, a purpose, this idea that someday you will was their strategy. The way that it was expressed, say, in the United Kingdom or the United States, which is really a someday you'll move beyond your work and be able to embrace your personal sense of achievement. So there'd be lots of images of extreme sports or yachting or these types of things that would say you're out there doing something and enjoying being in the moment. In Taiwan, that had a much more materialistic feel, and again, a huge market for whiskey, that someday you will achieve, your goals in terms of business and material success. So it's really speaking authentically to what those values are and adapting the message where you think you need to, and hopefully gaining some efficiencies across perhaps cultural groupings that share myths and stories and so on. But yes, what's authentic in one culture may not necessarily be authentic in another in terms of its expression. All right, well, another question. Damalola asks, can a brand switch from one brand character to the other due to circumstances beyond control? I think that's what, in a sense, what I was getting at with the example I used with Gillette. And in a way, it's kind of, you're still kind of waiting to see what happens with Gillette, because of course there's a whole market dynamic around that makes that more problematic as well. But I think we sit in situations that are beyond our control. So I think one of the things, obviously, for example, would be the Black Lives Matter movement, Black Lives Matter movement. And a lot of brands have obviously felt, including the University of Sussex, have felt that we need to say something. Our audience expects us to say something. But how do we say something that is really true and sincere when we really had no kind of history in this space? We've not dealt with these issues before. And you can see, obviously, with Pepsi and Kendall Jenner, that how quickly that can go wrong. And sometimes it's just coming out and saying, we don't have any kind of history in this space. So let's take small steps and let's acknowledge that situation and let's try and do better or speak to a different character. I think in COVID is another interesting example where you've seen a lot of brands effectively pivot their operations to do something really relevant for the times. Now, for some brands, it's really, in a sense, it seems more difficult, but it's quite easy. So if you think about Louis Vuitton, for example, making hand sanitizer, operationally quite easy because they've got all the history in making alcohol and perfume. Image-wise, quite difficult. But of course, luxury brands' expectations are always much higher upon them in times of crisis. And so stepping up and playing their part as a member of as a French business as opposed to a business is something that's really in their blood, and they get that, and that will become part of their narrative, over many years. But it partly goes to that line I talked about earlier of disruption, of challenging something that you do own, so you have some ownership in it, putting up with a lot of flack. The flack is an example of sacrifice, and sacrifice is really valuable in the sense of authenticity because it means we're giving something up, which shows sincerity. And then ultimately being able to tie that back into a renewed brand story. So you can imagine Gillette, it's still about masculinity. It's just realigned expectations of masculinity, both in a real sense and an aspirational sense. That's a great question. An anonymous question. What advice can you offer a new business with a founder who's already had a strong brand, but wants to build a company brand, that is not linked to his or her personal brand? You've got a range of different options here. It's a really good question because ultimately people obviously bring authenticity to a brand. That's the advantage of founder brands. But then people are people. They both ultimately die. So they're temporal, but they also, of course, have messy lives that can come into conflict with the statements of the brand. So you can either just simply put yourself aside and just build an aspirational set of values and deliver on those consistently in the sort of classical brand building techniques. And so the founder's story in all of this becomes, much less clear. I think that's a little bit of a cop-out in a sense, because I think there obviously is something interesting in your person and your character. Everyone has something interesting about themselves that you should tell. Otherwise, you do end up with a kind of brand that just lacks a certain something, and often lacks a certain emotional resonance. And I think a lot of the tech brands that come out of Southeast Asia. They're great stories in the background, but they've never really told them in the way that American or European brands have. The other way is to, of course, maybe take not so much your personal story, but just some aspects, some sort of symbolic aspects of that personal story, and then communicate that into a brand. So not so much you personally, but then maybe taking that up to the next level of abstraction, right, and dealing with it at the level of values, and just showing that perhaps, through your actions, that these are things you embody. And the final question, perfectly on time actually, from another anonymous attendee. Thank you for this. Do you think brands that center their existence on platforms such as Instagram create too many challenges, or may benefit for being exclusively based on social networks, avoiding prints and so on? Yeah, I think this is a really interesting challenge. I think what happens with platform brands is you've got to realize that because you are automatically part of a feed of people, you are a communal brand. And conformity, therefore, becomes really, really important. And a lot of brands I see, when things go wrong, one of the brands I wrote about in the textbook is Kat Von D. Kat Von D, came out and has made a number of, personal statements. She's built her brand around her personality, obviously, in her personal story. When she had a child, she decided that she would announce online that she wasn't going to get that child vaccinated. Now, there was a big backlash against that online from her fans, effectively saying, hang on a minute, this isn't really very healthy. And she really pushed back. And the killer you see all the time with a lot of these brands is, hang on, don't criticize me for my opinions. This is my page. And that's a mistake. It's not your page. It's, of course, the fans and the communal page. And you have to understand, what the norms of interaction are, what the expectations are. And in that situation, sometimes it's a classic case of, even in the offline world where the consumer's going against you, it's best not, to resist it. And it's the same thing in the online world around platforms. So I think on that case, it's probably heightened because you have almost less time to make mistakes and then correct those mistakes. And Von D effectively had to be brought out by Kendo, and the brand itself changed. Not in a way I would agree with, but it's moved now just to KVD. to rescue effectively that brand. I think the avoiding print TV, I think on an operational level, I would always argue that's a little bit of a mistake. Those media are still very effective, and so I would always build a campaign around multiple media. But I think for me, ultimately, the challenge is understanding the communal dynamics, and that you will have to give up some control online, and that's not a bad thing. That actually reinforces your brand. But then to also understand that many of the people that follow you online, may have like-minded values, but they also have, other values as well that may not really show themselves until a breach occurs. And that's what you've got to be a little bit mindful. So I think knowing your audience and knowing your communal rules becomes really critical in that instance. I think we're on time, and I think, thank you. Those are amazing questions. Thank you so much. I obviously, this is some of the material that I teach in class here at Sussex, along with all my colleagues. So I'd like to thank you all for taking the time for joining me today, and wish you all well. Thank you.